The Bell Jar Full Book Summary. Part 1. It was a queer, sultry summer, the kind that pressed against your skin and made the air feel like water. Esther Greenwood was in New York City, wrapped in the gloss of glamour but stranded in a fog of detachment. She had won a guest editorship at a prestigious magazine, a dream for most girls her age, but it felt more like a performance than a prize. Everywhere she went, the world shimmered with possibilities. There were fashion shows, cocktail parties, rooftop lunches, and beauty pageants. Yet Esther drifted through it all like a ghost in borrowed clothes. She watched the other girls laugh and flirt and pose for photographers. She smiled when she was supposed to, nodded at the right times, but inside she was unraveling. I was supposed to be having the time of my life, she thought. I guess it was a letdown. Nothing tasted real. The city lights felt like stage lights. Even the food, stuffed avocados, finger sandwiches, pink champagne, felt like props in a play she hadn't auditioned for, and yet she kept showing up. She wore the makeup, curled her hair, and tried to mold her voice into something sophisticated. It didn't work. She shared a hotel room with Doreen, a bold, confident girl with a southern accent and a don't-care attitude. Doreen wasn't like the others. She smoked too much, drank too much, and flirted without restraint. Esther admired her recklessness the same way one admires a burning building, beautiful, terrifying, impossible to look away from. One night, Doreen dragged Esther to a smoky jazz bar where they met a man named Lenny. Esther felt like a satellite in orbit, watching, circling, but never landing. Eventually, Doreen disappeared with Lenny into the night, and Esther stumbled back to the hotel alone, sickened and detached. Her clothes smelled of liquor and disappointment. The experience left a taste of bitterness in her mouth, not because she wanted what Doreen had, but because she didn't want any of it, and she was starting to realize that this made her different. As the weeks passed, Esther's detachment deepened. She was expected to smile, to sparkle, to embody the American dream girl, but all she wanted was to be left alone. She couldn't sleep. Her thoughts swirled in dark eddies. The magazine gave her fancy clothes and perfume samples, but they meant nothing. They were just things, and things didn't fix the ache that had begun to settle inside her chest. She began imagining ways to disappear, not dramatically, just quietly, like melting into the air or slipping under a wave. The disconnection wasn't sudden, it was slow, a fade, a thickening fog. People kept talking to her, but their words seemed to come from underwater. I felt very still and very empty, she thought. She tried to write. She had always loved words, but now they slipped from her fingers like smoke. Every time she sat at the typewriter, her hands froze. The sentences were lifeless. Her mind echoed with static. When her time in New York ended, she returned home to the suburbs, expecting to be accepted into a writing course for the summer. When the rejection letter came, it crushed her. It wasn't just a lost opportunity. It was the unraveling thread. She stared at the letter for hours, then days. She stopped brushing her hair. She couldn't read. She couldn't sleep. Nights stretched into mornings and mornings into gray afternoons. Her mother told her to cheer up, to think positively. You just need to keep busy, she said. But Esther was already busy drowning in herself. She stopped changing her clothes. She stopped showering. Her reflection blurred in the mirror. She forgot what her own voice sounded like. And still the world kept turning. She went to a psychiatrist. He was clean-shaven, well-dressed, and utterly useless. Without asking many questions, he prescribed her electroconvulsive therapy, shock treatments. No preparation, no explanation, just cold metal, bright lights, and blinding pain. Esther screamed through it, and when it was over, she vowed never to return. The betrayal ran deep. She had reached for help, and the system had handed her a live wire. That night she considered dying. Not for attention, not for drama. For silence. Part 2. Esther Greenwood began to map the possibilities of her own disappearance. It wasn't always about dying. Sometimes it was about vanishing, slipping out of the world quietly like mist from a mirror. She didn't want anyone to scream or weep over her. She didn't want drama. What she wanted was stillness. But the world would not let her be still. The days dragged on in the small suburban house she shared with her mother. The walls were tight. The rooms were filled with her mother's cheerful voice, her shallow optimism, her insistence that Esther go outside or call a friend. Esther didn't want any of it. She wanted space. She wanted silence. She wanted more than anything to escape the growing sense that she was trapped inside a glass bell jar, a place where she could see the world but couldn't touch it, couldn't breathe it. Her mother suggested another psychiatrist. But by then, Esther had lost faith in the entire profession. The memory of the electric current, the blinding white light, the seizure, the smell of burning nerves, it haunted her. If that was healing, she wanted no part of it. She stopped pretending. She stopped trying. She thought about sleeping pills. She tried to read medical articles about dosage. She stole a bottle from the medicine cabinet, counted the pills, wondered how many would do the job. But even this wasn't straightforward. Her thoughts were fractured. Her plans were vague. Her fear came and went like a tide. One day, she crawled into the crawl space beneath the house and curled up in the dark. She stayed there for hours, unbothered, unmissed. The silence was a comfort, a kind of womb. Later, she considered drowning. She waded into the ocean and let the waves pull at her, but her body fought back. Her lungs screamed. Her limbs refused to give in. It was humiliating, this failure to disappear. Then one night, she found a bottle of sleeping pills. She brought a glass of water to her room, laid a blanket on the floor of a hidden crawl space, and began swallowing the pills one after another. She lost count. She felt detached, almost peaceful. The world blurred around the edges. Darkness came like a wave, but not death. They found her, they revived her, they brought her back. She woke in a hospital room, confused and half ashamed. Her mother stood nearby, her face lined with worry and disappointment. Esther could hardly bear the sight of her. All her mother's forced cheer, her insistence that everything would be fine, it felt like a lie, a denial of everything Esther was feeling. She wanted to scream, "It's not fine, I'm not fine." She was moved to a mental institution. The first one was bleak, more prison than hospital. The other women were hollow-eyed, shuffling, silent. Some muttered to themselves. Some sat in corners, staring. Esther felt no kinship with them. She wasn't crazy, she told herself. She was just sad, just tired, just done. The nurses were cold, the doctors were distant. She was prescribed more treatments, more interviews, more pills. She began to detach again. One day, her case was transferred. She was sent to a private facility thanks to a benefactor who had heard about her. The name was whispered, Philomena Guinea, a famous novelist who had once been through her own breakdown and now funded help for other young women. The new hospital was clean, open, quiet. The doctors spoke gently. One in particular, Dr. Nolan, was different. She was a woman, and more than that, she listened. Esther didn't trust her immediately, but the softness in her voice was disarming. Unlike the others, Nolan didn't offer empty encouragement. She didn't say, "Cheer up" or "It'll pass." She let Esther speak or not speak. She let the silence stretch, and somehow that helped. Esther was given time. She read again slowly, carefully. Words returned to her like old friends. She watched the other women in the hospital, some recovering, some lost. There was Joan, a girl she had known from college. Joan had also attempted suicide. She was neat, polite, well-behaved, but something simmered under the surface, something fragile. They formed a strange bond, not quite friendship, not quite rivalry, just a shared knowledge of pain. Esther began to write again, too. At first, just notes. Then lines. Then pages. The words were awkward, uncertain, but they came. Dr. Nolan introduced Esther to a new kind of electroshock therapy, one that was done with care, with anesthesia, with preparation. Esther feared it, but agreed, and this time the experience was different. There was no blinding pain. No burning. Just a flicker, a shift, a silence. She wasn't healed overnight. But something changed. The world wasn't suddenly bright, but it was less dark. The bell jar was still there, but it had lifted slightly. She could breathe. Part 3. Esther began to notice the quiet details of living again. The way morning light stretched across her hospital room, the rustle of paper when she turned a page, the soft murmur of nurses in the hallway. Life wasn't beautiful, it wasn't even comfortable, but it was no longer unbearable. It had texture. Dr. Nolan had become an anchor, not because she offered answers, but because she didn't pretend to have them. She never flinched at Esther's words. When Esther admitted she had considered suicide again, Nolan simply nodded. "We're not afraid of that here," she said. "We face it." That honesty meant more than any sedative. Still, the darkness lingered. Esther's sense of identity was fragile, full of cracks. She didn't know who she was outside her pain. At the hospital, she was a patient. Before that, she was a promising writer, a student, a daughter. None of those labels felt solid now. What did she want? To be a poet, a mother, a lover, to be invisible. Every role felt like a costume. She thought about men, about the way the world measured a woman's worth in purity and obedience. She thought about marriage and how it seemed like a death of the self. She thought about sex, not with fear, but with curiosity, with anger, with resentment. She remembered Buddy Willard. Buddy had been her almost boyfriend once. Clean-cut, ambitious, full of wholesome expectations. He wanted to marry Esther after med school. He called her poems cute. He called her ambition a phase. Esther had once admired him. Then she saw through him. She remembered visiting him in the hospital when he had tuberculosis. He had seemed softer, vulnerable. But even then, he assumed she would give up her dreams, her independence, her voice to become his wife. She remembered when he told her he had slept with another girl. He had confessed it like it was a noble sacrifice. Esther hadn't cried. She had felt hollow. He had expected her to forgive him, to accept the imbalance because she was pure and he was a man. That double standard burned. Back in the hospital, Esther decided she would lose her virginity on her own terms. It wasn't about love or romance, it was about control. She found a man, Erwin, a math professor. He was polite, dull, and safe. The experience was clinical, awkward, but it was hers. Later, she bled heavily and had to be rushed to the hospital. But even through the pain, Esther felt a grim satisfaction. The purity myth was dead. She was no longer defined by someone else's expectations. Meanwhile, Joan, her shadow, her reflection, grew more complicated. Joan admired Esther perhaps too much. She mimicked her tone, her movements. She hovered. At first, Esther tolerated it, but eventually the closeness became suffocating. Joan's presence reminded her of all she was trying to leave behind. When Joan disappeared from the hospital one afternoon, no one panicked at first. But that evening her body was found. She had hanged herself in the woods. Esther did not cry. She felt a strange stillness, a cold echo in her bones. She wondered if Joan had done it because Esther was recovering, because she couldn't. Or maybe Joan had just reached her end. Esther didn't know, but she felt the weight of it. She went to Joan's funeral wearing a borrowed black dress and stood in the cold earth, thinking about how easily a person could vanish. That night she sat with Dr. Nolan. "I'll never forget her," Esther said. Nolan nodded. "You're not supposed to, but you don't have to follow her." There was silence. Then Esther asked, "Will it always be like this? Will I always feel watched by it?" "Maybe," Nolan said, "but it won't always be this close." Time passed. Slowly. Esther was allowed to visit home on weekends. She took walks in the garden. She wrote more. Her poems were halting, uneven, but honest. Not for publication, just for herself. She didn't smile often, but when she did, it felt real. The hospital began to prepare her for release. There was a final interview, a board, a decision. She wore a simple dress, no makeup, no mask. She answered questions plainly. When they asked how she felt, she said, "Better, not perfect, not fixed, but better." They asked about Joan. "I miss her," Esther said, "but I'm not her." That night she sat alone in her room, staring out the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the floor. She imagined the bell jar, its glass curve, its suffocating silence. It wasn't gone, but it had lifted. Just enough. She could breathe. Part 4. The day of Esther's release was gray but calm. Clouds stretched thin across the sky like worn fabric, letting in just enough light to keep the world from feeling hollow. She stood at the threshold of the hospital, one hand on the door, the other holding a modest suitcase. There were no crowds, no banners, no dramatic goodbyes, just a quiet nod from the nurse and a final word from Dr. Nolan. "Remember, you can always call me." Esther nodded, but she didn't feel triumphant. She felt cautious. The world outside hadn't changed. Cars still passed too quickly on the roads. Strangers still spoke too loudly in cafes. People still asked the wrong questions. "Are you feeling better now? Is it all behind you? Was it just a phase?" Esther gave polite answers. But inside she knew something they didn't. The bell jar doesn't disappear. It hovers, it waits. It lifts sometimes, but it never shatters. Back at her mother's home, the house was the same. Clean, small, lined with polite smiles and shallow optimism. Her mother tried hard not to talk about what had happened and not to talk about anything real either. There were casseroles and game shows, folded towels and awkward silences. Esther managed them all with careful distance. She didn't blame her mother, but she didn't trust her either. She applied to college again. A different school, a new city. No big plans, just structure. She saw a new therapist. She took long walks. She watched other people, studied them like characters in a play. She still felt detached at times, but she knew how to ride the feeling now. It was like standing at the edge of a cold sea. She could choose not to dive in. Memories came in fragments. Doreen's perfume, the hum of the electroshock machine, Joan's eyes before she vanished, the taste of sleeping pills on her tongue. But they didn't choke her anymore. They passed through like shadows. Esther learned how to let them pass. She went to the library often. She read poetry again, Sylvia Plath, Emily Dickinson, T.S. Eliot. She didn't just read their words. She read between them. She found herself in them. Sometimes she wrote her own. The poems were not hopeful, but they were hers. She sat in cafes and listened to people talk. Couples bickered, students laughed too loudly, professors droned on about politics and art. Esther didn't envy them. She didn't long to be part of the noise. She preferred the corner seat, the one by the window where she could see everything and touch nothing. That was enough. For now. One day she passed a bridal shop, white gowns in the window, mannequins with painted smiles, rows of shoes too clean to wear. She stopped and stared. Buddy Willard's voice echoed in her memory, "You'll want babies, you'll settle down." But Esther no longer needed to argue with that version of the future. She just didn't believe in it. She wasn't angry. She was free. Sometimes loneliness clung to her like fog, but she had learned not to run from it. She let it sit beside her, she let it speak. And then when it was done, she let it go. She visited Joan's grave once. It was a simple marker on a hillside, surrounded by silence. Esther didn't cry. She just stood there for a while, letting the wind tangle her hair. She whispered, "I'm still here." Then she turned and walked away. Part 5. The days were quieter now. There were no sirens, no hospital corridors, no trembling hands reaching for pills in the dark. Esther moved through her new life like someone learning to walk again, cautiously, attentively, one deliberate step at a time. She enrolled in classes. She read novels, sat through lectures, wrote notes that didn't feel like scribbles but thoughts. Her handwriting was steadier now. Her voice in class was soft but present. She wasn't brilliant. She wasn't broken. She was somewhere in between. She got a small room in a student boarding house. It was plain, a bed, a desk, a window. But it was hers. There were nights when she sat awake, not with fear, but with awareness. The kind that lingers just before sleep, not dread, but something more like readiness. She had changed, but the world hadn't. The other girls at school talked about careers and weddings, about which men were serious and which were just for fun. Esther listened without judgment, but she didn't join in. Not because she looked down on them, because she was tired of playing roles that weren't written for her. She didn't want to be the girlfriend or the wife or the good girl who waited for someone else's permission to live. She wanted to write, to walk, to breathe, to not be defined by who she pleased or what she pleased them with. She kept a journal. Sometimes she wrote about the past, not in detail, but in fragments, the kind of memories that floated up uninvited. A white ceiling light flickering above her hospital bed. The feel of damp earth after the pills. The weight of silence in her mother's car. She didn't push the memories away. She didn't let them anchor her either. She just wrote them down. Pages turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Her mind felt less like a battlefield and more like a room with an open window. She went on long walks. Alone. Not because she was avoiding people, but because solitude no longer meant isolation. Sometimes she passed children playing, old couples walking hand in hand, shopkeepers arranging displays. She didn't envy them. She just watched. The world didn't need to revolve around her pain anymore. She could let it turn without asking it to slow down. She met a man once in the library. He was kind, soft-voiced, curious. They spoke about poetry and music. He asked her to dinner. She said yes. It was simple, polite. But she didn't feel the need to impress him. She didn't calculate her words, didn't pretend to be anyone else. And when he walked her home and didn't kiss her, she didn't feel rejected. She felt in control. She started writing stories again. Not about her life, at least not directly. But the characters resembled her in pieces. A girl staring into the ocean, a woman who spoke only in questions, a figure who walked through fire and came out carrying a mirror. Her stories weren't neat. They didn't have happy endings. But they had breaths. And that was enough. One afternoon, she returned to her room to find a letter waiting. It was from the hospital, the board that had once evaluated her. A follow-up invitation, a kind of final conversation before they considered her fully released from care. The paper trembled slightly in her hands. Not out of fear, but recognition. The bell jar was descending again. She sat down at her desk, took a deep breath, and picked up her pen. She didn't write about the future. She wrote about what she would bring into that room when she returned. Her silence, her words, her scars, and her choice not to disappear. Part 6. The appointment was set for noon. Esther dressed simply, a dark skirt, a clean blouse, no makeup. She didn't want to wear armor. She wanted to walk into the room as she was, not as anyone expected her to be. Outside, the sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. She walked through the city with measured steps. The pavement shimmered slightly from an earlier shower. The people around her moved quickly, umbrellas in hand, eyes downcast. But Esther kept her gaze forward. She wasn't afraid. Not of the board. Not of what they might ask. Not even of herself. The building was the same as she remembered. White walls, polished floors, the quiet hush of a place built for assessment. She checked in at the front desk. The woman handed her a clipboard. Esther filled out the form slowly. Name, date of birth, medical history. She paused at the question, have you had suicidal thoughts in the past 6 months? She circled no. Not because the thoughts had vanished completely, but because they no longer ruled her. They were visitors now, not residents. The waiting room was small. A few chairs. A plant in the corner. A magazine rack filled with out-of-date issues. Esther didn't pick one up. She just sat. Her fingers rested on her knees, her breathing was slow, her mind was still. The bell jar hovered as it always did. But it was made of glass. And glass could crack. They called her name. She stood, walked down the hallway, entered the room. 3 people sat behind a table, 2 women, 1 man. All of them had files, pens, polite expressions. They asked about her classes, her sleep, her writing, her support network, her thoughts. Esther answered truthfully. I have difficult days, she said, but I manage them. They nodded, asked more. She spoke about poetry, about morning walks, about Joan, about how she had learned not to outrun the darkness but to walk beside it without letting it lead. She didn't cry. She didn't perform. She existed. And for the first time, that was enough. When they thanked her and told her she could go, she stood slowly. They said they'd be in touch with their decision. But Esther already knew. Not because she had said the right things, but because she hadn't said them to be right. She had said them to be real. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet pavement and fresh leaves. She walked for a while with no destination. Just movement. Just breath. That night she wrote in her journal. I took a deep breath and listened to the old brag of my heart. I am, I am, I am. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if the bell jar would descend again. But she knew that if it did, she would be ready. She would not be erased. She would not vanish. She would be seen. The end.